Pirates in popular culture are charming, swaggering, and perpetually drunk on rum with nowhere to be. They have loyal crews, dramatic sword fights, and enough treasure to retire comfortably whenever they choose. They are free in a way that ordinary people watching them on screen are not. That is the version. Here is the actual version. The golden age of piracy lasted from roughly 1650 to 1730, and it was not glamorous. It was desperate, violent, disease-ridden, and ended badly for almost everyone who lived it. The average working pirate was not a swashbuckling adventurer who chose freedom over comfort. He was usually a former merchant sailor or naval sailor who had run out of better options. This is what your life as a pirate actually looked like. Part 1. How you became a pirate. Almost nobody woke up one morning and decided to become a pirate as a lifestyle choice. The path to piracy usually ran through one of three routes, and none of them were romantic. The first route was the merchant navy, where conditions were so brutal that piracy looked like an improvement. Merchant sailors in the 17th and 18th centuries worked under captains who had total authority over their lives. They could be beaten, starved, refused pay, or simply abandoned in a foreign port at the captain's discretion. Pay was low, voyages were long, and the mortality rate from disease alone was staggering. The second route was the naval navy, which was often even worse than the merchant service. Naval sailors in this period could be pressed into service against their will through a process called impressment. Press gangs roamed port towns at night and physically forced men onto warships with no warning and no consent. Once pressed, you served until the ship returned to home port, which could take years. The third route was direct recruitment, where an existing pirate crew captured a merchant vessel and offered the crew a choice: join us voluntarily or be set adrift. Many merchant sailors chose to join, not out of enthusiasm for piracy, but out of preference for survival. What all three routes had in common was that the decision was rarely made from a position of genuine freedom. Piracy was not a calling. It was usually the least bad option available at a particular moment. Part 2. Life aboard the ship. A pirate ship was a working vessel crewed by men who needed to keep it operational to survive. There was nothing romantic about the physical environment. Below decks, the space was dark, cramped, and perpetually damp from seawater seeping through the hull. The smell below decks on a ship that had been at sea for weeks was genuinely unbearable. Bilge water, unwashed bodies, rotting food, and the waste of dozens of men accumulated in an enclosed space. Hammocks were slung so close together that sleeping men touched on both sides. There was no concept of personal space because there was no physical space to be personal with. The food situation was a constant source of misery on long voyages. Fresh provisions lasted only a few days before the heat and humidity of tropical waters destroyed them. After the fresh food ran out, sailors ate hardtack, which was a dense biscuit baked to be almost indestructible. Hardtack that had been at sea long enough was reliably infested with weevils and maggots. Sailors developed the habit of tapping hardtack on the table before eating to knock out the largest insects. This was not considered unusual. It was just part of the routine. Scurvy was the most feared disease on long ocean voyages, and it was genuinely horrifying in its progression. It was caused by a lack of vitamin C, which nobody in the 17th century understood or could explain. The early symptoms were fatigue and joint pain, which were easy to dismiss as the normal discomfort of seafaring. As it progressed, gums became soft and began to bleed, teeth loosened and fell out, and old wounds reopened. Wounds that had healed years or even decades earlier would inexplicably reopen as the body broke down from within. Men who had suffered injuries long before going to sea would watch those injuries return as if they had never healed. Death from advanced scurvy was slow, painful, and demoralizing in a way that battle wounds were not. Part 3. The Pirate Code and what it actually meant. Pirate ships operated under a set of agreed rules that historians call the Pirate Code or Articles. This was one of the genuinely unusual aspects of pirate life compared to legal maritime employment. Before joining a pirate crew, each sailor signed or marked the articles with an X if he could not write. The articles specified how plunder would be divided, what compensation was paid for injuries, and what behavior was prohibited. This democratic element was remarkable for its time, and stands in sharp contrast to naval and merchant practice. On a Navy ship, the captain's word was absolute law backed by the threat of flogging and hanging. On a pirate ship, the captain was elected by the crew and could be voted out for poor performance. During battle, the captain had complete authority over tactical decisions, which made military sense. Outside of battle, the crew had significant say in where the ship went and what targets were pursued. The compensation clauses for injuries were specific and surprisingly structured. Bartholomew Roberts, one of the most successful pirates in history, had articles that paid fixed amounts for lost limbs. A lost right arm was worth more than a lost left arm because most men were right-handed. A lost eye or finger had its own designated payment rate separate from the loss of a full limb. This sounds progressive until you understand the context. The payment came from the shared plunder and was designed to prevent injured men from becoming a burden on the crew. It was practical accounting dressed up as fairness rather than genuine humanitarian concern. The no prey, no pay principle meant that a voyage that failed to capture anything left everyone with nothing. Long, unsuccessful voyages led to desperate crews making increasingly reckless decisions about which ships to attack. Attacking a vessel that turned out to be a warship rather than a merchant ship was a common and fatal mistake. Part 4. The Violence and the Reality of Capture. Popular culture has given piracy a theatrical quality that the reality did not share. Sword fights on ship decks did happen, but they were not elegant or prolonged. Most successful pirate attacks were resolved through intimidation rather than actual combat. A merchant vessel that saw a pirate flag and realized it was outgunned had a simple calculation to make. Resist and almost certainly die in a fight you cannot win, or surrender and probably survive. Most merchant captains chose to survive, which meant most pirate attacks ended without significant bloodshed. The pirates preferred this outcome too because fighting damaged the ship and killed men they could not easily replace. When violence did occur, it was fast, brutal, and nothing like the choreographed duels of cinema. Boarding actions involved men hacking at each other in cramped conditions with minimal space to maneuver. Pistols were fired at point-blank range where missing was almost impossible. The wounded received attention only after the fight was over, and often not even then. Pirates who were captured by naval forces faced a specific and unpleasant legal process. Piracy was a capital crime under the laws of every European maritime nation during the Golden Age. Captured pirates were tried in admiralty courts, which were designed specifically to secure convictions efficiently. The trial was often brief, and the outcome was rarely in doubt before proceedings began. Conviction meant hanging, which was carried out publicly at the waterfront as a warning to other sailors. In England, the location was Execution Dock at Wapping on the Thames. The body was sometimes left hanging in a metal cage called a gibbet at the entrance to the harbor. It stayed there until it decomposed completely, which could take years in the salt air. Every sailor arriving in port sailed past it and understood exactly what it was meant to communicate. Part 5. How it ended for most pirates. The golden age of piracy ended not because pirates reformed, but because governments got serious about stopping them. Naval patrols increased dramatically in the Caribbean and along Atlantic trade routes from the 1710s onward. The economics of piracy shifted as merchant convoys began sailing with naval escorts that pirates could not overpower. Targets became harder to find, harder to attack, and harder to escape from after attacking. The crew of a pirate ship that had not captured anything in months was a crew on the edge of mutiny. Desperate men made desperate decisions, and desperate decisions shortened lives considerably. Blackbeard, whose real name was Edward Teach, died in battle off the coast of North Carolina in 1718. He was shot 5 times and stabbed approximately 20 times before he stopped fighting. His head was cut off and hung from the bowsprit of the naval vessel that defeated him. Bartholomew Roberts, who captured over 400 vessels in 3 years, died in battle in 1722. He was hit by grapeshot from a naval vessel and died almost instantly. His crew threw his body overboard before surrendering, because he had specifically requested that outcome. He did not want to be captured dead and displayed as a trophy the way Blackbeard had been. Most pirates did not die in dramatic last stands remembered by history. Most died of disease, of infection from untreated wounds, of scurvy, or of drowning when ships went down in storms. The ones who survived long enough to be captured were hanged at the waterfront with no ceremony. A small number successfully retired, having accumulated enough plunder to disappear into ordinary life somewhere. The historical record suggests this number was very small, and most of those retirements were not comfortable. A man who had spent years at sea had few transferable skills, and even fewer willing to employ him. The golden age of piracy lasted about 80 years and produced a mythology that has lasted 3 centuries. The mythology is more vivid and more entertaining than the reality, because that is what mythology does. It takes people who were mostly desperate, mostly diseased, and mostly short-lived, and turns them into symbols of freedom. The real pirates were not free. They were trapped by poverty, by violence, and by a system that had no place for them. They chose piracy the way people choose any bad option because the alternatives looked worse at the time. They ate weevil-infested hardtack and slept in hammocks touching strangers on both sides. They watched their gums bleed and their old wounds reopen and had no idea why it was happening. They spent most of their time bored, hungry, and waiting for something to happen. When something did happen, it was over quickly and was nothing like the films. The ones who survived were the ones who quit early enough or got lucky enough. The truth is, most of them were neither.